Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 7 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the New Jersey Devils, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1. So Sharks fans were left wondering after their victory against the New York Rangers, their first victory of the entire season, how the Sharks would go from there, and would they be able to carry that sort of momentum into this set of weekend games against the New Jersey Devils and the Philadelphia Flyers? Well, we got our answer here today. The Sharks did lose, in fact, to the New Jersey Devil by a score of 2-1, and while this may appear close on the scoreboard, and with those last couple of minutes, certainly the Sharks did come close to tying this game, it was pretty clear that the Sharks were the far worse team here today against this Devils squad, and they should be thanking their goaltender for even allowing the Sharks to skate in this third period in a relevant game, because it otherwise likely would have been, 4-1, maybe even 5-1 of a final score. And this was an extremely prototypical game for the San Jose Sharks for this season thus far, as the periods went just about as expected as if you were also watching the Sharks just during the first 6 games of this season. The first period was once again pretty solid from San Jose. They didn't give the Devils too much to work with, and while the Devils did have a decent end to that period, the Sharks actually kept pace with them, and the score was 0-0 after the first. The second period was once again very similar to second periods of previous games the Sharks have played. For whatever reason, while the Sharks continuously come out with strong firsts, they also then come out with awful second periods. The Sharks give up the first 2 goals of this game to Sharangovich and Mercer to give the Devils a 2-0 lead in the second period, and while they would cut into that lead with a goal from Kevin Labanc, that would be the score at the end of 40 minutes. In the third period, like the usual, the San Jose Sharks were half decent in the third period, but not able to actually generate any goals. The Devils just completely shut them down rather easily, and besides those last few minutes where the Devils not only took a penalty, but the Sharks also pulled the goaltender and got some decent opportunities, and like I said, they came relatively close to actually being able to tie this game. In fact, they hit a post from Erik Karlsson off of a very nice shot from the point, but otherwise not much doing, and the Sharks would lose 2-1. And just generally, it was a very similar game to how the Sharks have always played thus far this season in terms of offense, defense, and goaltending, which I will get to right now. In terms of offensive production, it's extremely difficult, I would say, to actually continuously review how these forwards play, because a game like this, nobody necessarily stood out in that much of a positive light. There were definitely a couple of players who I said, this guy had an okay game, but nothing amazing. I take a look at the first line here from Barabanov, Hertl, and Timo Meier. I was hoping that their few solid shifts against the Rangers the other night and that overtime goal that at least Hertl and Meier and Karlsson were able to score to win that game for the San Jose Sharks would lead to some bigger and better things here moving forward, and these two players could really snap out of this early season slump, but that didn't necessarily actually end up happening. This line did get a couple of good chances in the first period, but just it's more of the same here from these players. There is not really enough offense generated from the San Jose Sharks and from these top players. I will take a quote that we had heard in the media from a Toronto Maple Leafs head coach. The Sharks' elite players are not playing like elite players, and that has been very much the case through much of these first 7 games of this season. When it comes to this sort of stapled together second line of Couture, Bonino, and Cunnin, I do continue to feel bad for Couture. This was a theme last season where Couture was playing with many players, especially near the end of the season, many players who definitely don't deserve to be second liners in the NHL, and that is something that seems to be continuing at this point. He's playing with Nick Bonino, who barely even deserves to be on an NHL roster at this point with how disappointing he has been thus far with the San Jose Sharks franchise, and Luke Cunnin, who besides a couple of decent first 2 games of the season, he hasn't been particularly impressive and has actually been a bit of a detriment to the San Jose Sharks over the last few games, and yet still manages to secure a second line spot. So while Couture, I do think over these past couple of games has looked okay by himself, by a sort of factor of his line mates, there just really isn't much that is actually able to happen there. With the third line, this is really the line that once again here stands out for the San Jose Sharks, and we did actually see a substitution for this game, which is honestly kind of surprising. I mean, the fact that the Sharks won their last game against the Rangers, and that was their only win of the season, I suspected that David Quinn would not change up the lineup at all, and yet he decides to swap out Yona Gadjevich for Kevin Labanc. Now, I don't dislike this move. I will never dislike a move that takes Jonah Gadjevich out of the lineup until that guy actually proves that he should be in the lineup. But besides his half-decent chemistry with Svechnikov and Nico Sturm, it's not as though he had really done much. But I do think that was mostly being carried by Nico Sturm. So Kevin Labanc does come in here for this game, and he scores the Sharks' only goal off of an extremely nice shot, which was basically really what we can expect from the San Jose Sharks, because they just can't actually offensively cycle this puck in the offensive zone. I think they had maybe, besides those last few minutes, obviously with the goaltender pulled and such, and anything on the power play, the Sharks had maybe 2 good 5-on-5 offensive zone shifts, and one of them was from this Nico Sturm line. Generally, Nico Sturm, it's kind of odd to say, is probably been the Sharks' best forward thus far this season. It's really weird to be able to say that because he's been mostly playing on the third and fourth line. It's not as though he's been like some sort of absolute dominant force for the San Jose Sharks, but pretty much everyone around them has been disappointing that he has been really allowed to shine in this way. So he really does a good job on this third line. Svechnikov, I thought, also looked pretty decent here tonight, and Kevin Labanc in particular earlier on in this game in the first period when the Sharks were actually skating well against the New Jersey Devils, I thought Labanc looked pretty decent. On the fourth line, I also thought this fourth line wasn't half bad. The grouping here of Lindblom, Matt Nieto, and Lorentz. Lorentz actually played a decent amount of ice time, and he continues to also be a relatively impressive player for the San Jose Sharks, compared to his expectations coming into this season. Lindblom has honestly been a bit of a disappointment this year, but at least this game was not too bad from him. And generally, it is once again yet another game. Like I said, this was a very prototypical game for the San Jose Sharks, where the Sharks' bottom six was pretty decent, but the Sharks' top six was mostly non-existent. On the defensive side of things, we saw another substitution. Now, the first substitution of this game of Gadjevich for Labanc, or I guess the opposite, Labanc in for Gadjevich, I didn't actually have a problem with, but this was one that I took a bit more exception with. The Sharks swapped out Jacob Megna for Scott Harrington, and I'm very confused about this substitution. I mean, the Sharks they won that game against the Rangers, and primarily it was because they managed to shut them down so convincingly in that third period, limiting them to just a single shot on goal in that final 20 minutes, or the final 20 minutes of regulation in that game. And while I won't say Megna was the leading force behind it, he clearly was a part of the defensive group playing constant shifts with Erik Karlsson. So to me, it's weird that you'll come into another game and say, well, let's bench Megna, part of that defensive core that did so well in shutting down the Rangers and basically played like the Sharks' best period of the entire year, and put in someone like Scott Harrington, who has played only a single game this season, and in that single game was not very good. Well, how did it go here today against the Devils? It was once again not very good. Harrington somehow manages to fall backwards here into a top-line spot with Erik Karlsson, multiple shifts here with the Sharks' best defenseman, and multiple shifts, and with Harrington just gets beaten off the boards to the net, just can't seem to follow. There was this one play that obviously stands out above the rest of where Jack Hughes comes in. Jack Hughes obviously an extremely skilled player, and Harrington not the most skilled defenseman, but Jack Hughes goes for the spinorama move and completely fools Scott Harrington. Harrington completely loses track of him, and Hughes is able to get a good shot on net, and that was really just a microcosm of what Harrington did, or I guess what he didn't do in the game here tonight. I don't exactly know why Harrington got a second game here. His first game was not particularly impressive. I don't even know why, honestly, he was even signed on a tryout offer, and I do hope he comes out of the lineup at this point and is just sort of left here until maybe like some sort of injury takes a couple of players out of the lineup, because he really doesn't deserve to be an NHL defenseman. It's maybe a bit mean to say, but it is very much the truth. When it comes to the other defensemen here for the San Jose Sharks, like I mentioned, once again, prototypical game for the San Jose Sharks. The defensive group as a whole structurally wasn't awful. There weren't many holes when the Devils were cycling it in the offensive zone for themselves, and they actually managed to defend decently well, but many of these Devils chances in this game, and where Kaapo Kähkönen had to come up so huge on many of these plays, was off the rush. We saw multiple 2-on-1s and odd man rushes and just players left completely wide open, not defended well. Ferraro made mistakes. Harrington, as I mentioned, made mistakes. Vlasic lost pucks. Benning made mistakes. And so while the Sharks are able, I've said this before, I'll say it again, while the Sharks are able to follow the structure of the defensive plan that David Quinn seems to lay out here for this team, when it breaks down to it and the Sharks play off against a skilled team or a more skilled team like the Devils that have players like Hughes and Hischier and Bratt and Mercer, these players are able to just absolutely abuse the Sharks' defensive core, which is amongst the worst in the entire league. And so it's really not that much of a surprise here that the Sharks end up giving up a lot of these types of high danger chances off of the rush and off of the transition game. And then finally, there is the goaltending here for the San Jose Sharks. Kähkönen, his previous performance this season, not particularly impressive, and so Reimer has gotten the majority of the starts thus far this year, but finally Kähkönen draws back in between the pipes because the Sharks are indeed playing a back-to-back game over this weekend, and Kähkönen was extremely impressive, so we will likely see a bit more of him as the time goes on. Didn't have too much of a chance on either of these goals. The Mercer one, Mercer is left all alone for not only a one-timer, but then to pick up his own rebound and take another shot right in front of the net on the Devils power play. And Sharangovich, a sort of 1-on-0 type of situation, is able to deke him out, which I can't really blame him for. Otherwise, he made a ton of fantastic saves. One of them, I believe, was on Miles Wood, which might end up being like a save of the week around the NHL at this point. And so generally a solid game, and the Sharks once again let their goaltender down. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, where they will take on the Philadelphia Flyers. The Sharks are now 1-6 on the year here, find themselves again continuously at the bottom of the standings, and we will see how long that continues. Class dismissed.